Okay, it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Joshua Chang. He got his bachelor's and master's from MIT, and then did an MD Ph.D. from UMass. He works on signal processing and is also very interested in applying techniques from control and machine learning to a lot of problems in computational health. So thanks for kicking us off and trying to get as many people as possible in person here. So thanks for being here and take it away.
Well, thank you very much. And I appreciate the time to be able to come in and share a little bit about my journey, I guess, for the last 12 years. As you see from today, the talk here is just about optimal control for electroceutical therapies. And you guys are all probably fairly familiar with the idea of pharmaceuticals, right? We know of drugs. When people get sick, you take a drug, you take medicine of some sort, and the ideal is that you get better. There's been a new wave kind of in the last about 10, 15 years that has been looking at the idea of electroceutical therapies. How do we use electricity as a way to treat a lot of diseases and systems? And so just to give you a little bit of history on this, oops, sorry. The idea of switches actually exists all over biology, from molecular level when we look at proteins that either activate or are not active, to cells that are replicating or in kind of stasis or quiescence, to networks of neurons that look at whether these are activated neurons networks or they're inactivated, to sleep-wake cycles for entire humans, right? These are all discrete states that can exist. And so you're either activated or inactivated, you're either sleeping or awake, though I'll guess that as students, we blow the line sometimes after a few all-nighters and such. But oftentimes we think of these as there's a switch going on in your brain, in the cell, in a pathway of some sort that will then trigger something to go from one state to another. And so one of the challenges that we're kind of positing as clinicians is, do these also exist in medicine? And we know that this actually is a fairly well-studied area as well, that these switches and these kind of bistable or discrete states do exist as well. Clearest example here is with vaccines, right? All of us have been hearing about the COVID vaccine. We've been looking at vaccinations and thinking about that. And so the idea that a small, brief drug that you're being given or dosage that you're being given has now switched your immune system from a vulnerable state to an immunized state. We also see this in the NICU or in the neonatal ICU, where infants actually stop breathing for periods of time because their neurology is not fully developed. Just by shaking their crib a little bit or vibrating the mattress that they're on a little bit can actually kickstart off their breathing patterns again back to normal. And so this is mechanical and chemical stimulation, but again, going back to electrical stimulation, which is where most of my work is, we see this with pacemakers, right? How many of you guys know someone with a pacemaker, or maybe like an elderly parent or grandparent that has some kind of cardio defibrillator, right? And so if their heart goes into an abnormal rhythm, a shock happens that pulls them back into normal rhythm. And again, you've got a very discrete stimulus that's being given that switches them from a pathological state to a normal, healthy state. More recently, Parkinson's, tremors, epilepsy, all of these things, there's deep brain stimulators now, spinal cord stimulators for people that are experiencing chronic back pain, for instance. People are even looking at the idea of electrical stimulation for things like depressive disorders or obsessive compulsive disorders. And so there's a very wide range of interest now in how do we apply electrical stimulation to kickstart pathological processes in the body. I even read papers recently about the idea, could we electrically stimulate the lungs, for instance, for people with COPD or asthma to try to get them breathing again in a healthier way? Or people that have diabetes, they're on constant insulin production, but can we shock the pancreas, for instance, and get insulin producing cells back into production again? And so there's a very wide range of almost every area of medicine right now. There's somebody probably thinking about how do electrical shocks play a role in treating these disorders, and can we actually cause switches back from abnormal behavior to normal, healthy systems? And again, so I'm going to focus predominantly on electrical stimulations, but a lot of the methodology that we're walking through can be applied to just about any other system, whether it's chemical stimulation, photostimulation, mechanical stimulation as well. Now, although the term electroceutical has been in use really in the last 10, 15 years, the idea of shocking somebody isn't new. Actually, all the way back in 46 AD, Scribonius Largus was the emperor's physician at that time to the Roman emperor. And he found out that if you took electric fish and shocked someone's head, you were able to heal headaches. Now, I don't know who his patients were or what kind of control study this was done in, but somehow he got that idea. And there is an anecdote that someone else was walking along the seaside their legs are walking through the water and they got shocked by by one of these electric fish, and their ankle joint pain was all of a sudden healed. And so maybe that's where it started. And then someone took the bright idea to stick someone's head in the water at the same time and cure headaches that way. But as you can imagine, since 46 AD, our ability to control electrical stimulation has drastically improved. We're now able to control not just the amplitude, the duration, we can change even now the shape of the stimulus itself. And so on the market now, there's a lot of studies done between, again, stimulating the trigeminal nerve to treat migraines, vagus nerve for epilepsy, the spinal cord for, again, chronic back pain, and arrhythmias, so again, pacemakers, cardiodefibrillators, all of these things. There's a huge market now for devices that, again, shock the brain, shock the heart, shock various other nerves in order to try to correct a lot of these systems.
Is electroshock therapy still a treatment for psychosis?
Yes, it is. Yeah, so electroconvulsive therapy, where there's still a lot of work being done to understand why it works so well as it does, but it is still, when I was training in the hospital, there's a whole department, or not a department, but there's a whole group that's focused on providing people that don't respond well to medication, ECT therapy, to try to shock, to basically correct a lot of these pathological behaviors that's going on in the brain, including a lot of psychiatric disorders.
And is magnetic? I understand there's some magnetic stimulation that seems to be related but different, or is this within your scope?
The methodology that I'll be discussing could potentially be used as well for magnetic stimulation. We haven't tried it with magnetic stimulation yet, but you're absolutely right that there is transcranial magnetic stimulation now that's being used as well to treat a lot of different disorders and pathological behaviors.
I'm hearing with great success. Right?
Yes, I've heard some really good stuff with TMS. There's also a lot of really interesting work done with ultrasound as well to try to get more fine tuning of the structures. So this is one specific device I wanted to talk about. NeuroPace. NeuroPace is a FDA-approved device that can be implanted in the brain specifically for epilepsy. And as you can see here, there's a signal that's being captured in terms of what the electrical brainwave activity is looking like. And once it starts detecting that a seizure is about to occur, it gives 5 shocks. And very often, it's able to then suppress behaviors, the seizure behavior or seizure activity. And this is done predominantly for, again, patients that don't respond well to therapies, to normal drug therapy. So this is a second line of defense for those patients.
Is it painful?
To my understanding, it's not. They don't feel it. It's tuned. They try very hard to tune the strength of the stimulus so that it's just enough to knock out the seizures, but not cause adverse effects for the patient. But that's something that we're going to talk about though, because trying to find out what that proper tuning is extremely hard and very difficult. And as you get to more and more complex disorders, especially with the psychiatric disorders, I've heard that it can take up to years, for instance, to figure out what the appropriate parameters are, so you don't go overboard with your stimulation. And so this is just an example again of tracking and looking at the brainwave activity. You've got seizure activity that's happening right here. You can see how it's kind of grown really big. And then the shock is given right here, and then you can see it goes right back to normal. And so this is a very discrete stimulus that's able to switch off pathological behavior in the brain. And so this was my PhD work, where we looked at the idea that you can go from state 1 to state 2. And if we assume state 1 is some kind of pathological behavior, like you're seizing, and you want to go to state 2 where you stop the seizure activity, there's a number of different ways to get there. But there's also a number of different ways that will actually leave you right back where you started. And so ultimately, the goal that we have is the question that we're wrestling with is Goldilocks principle, right? Like too much, and you're actually going to cause damage to the brain, especially considering how small the brain is. Any shock that you're going to give could easily leak over to neighboring structures. And so as part of the tuning process, there's a lot of work to make sure that when they shock you for Parkinson's, for epilepsy, you don't have, hallucinatory effects. While you might reduce tremors in your hand, you don't suddenly lose balance and ability to kind of walk straight anymore. So there's a whole lot of things that goes onto this tuning process. And that can happen if you have too much energy and you're over-shocking that area. But same thing, if you give too little energy, then you're not doing anything for the patient except giving them extra electrons, which no one really needs. Yes?
So is the general idea here that you have this super complicated dynamical system that has somehow reached this bad equilibrium, and with just enough of a nudge, it will get out of that bad equilibrium and magically go to the good equilibrium, right? So
Right.
it's not that we're doing anything, it's not that you're sophisticatedly targeting or moving away from the bad equilibrium. It's not that you're just moving, right? So you're setting a random perturbation and hoping to get out of the bad equilibrium. That seems to be the general idea.
That's a general idea, but the understanding, exactly what you said, but the understanding of the dynamical space itself is a big question mark right now. There's not a lot known. And as I'll describe later on, there are many times where the same size of the shock, if given at the wrong time, could actually bring you right back to where you started because you're not perturbing it into the other equilibrium well, for instance. And so understanding that dynamical space is kind of, from my perspective, is one of the big things that would be really cool to better understand and flesh out. And that would give us a lot more insight than how do you get from one stable point to the healthier stable point.
Another question, does it transfer between patients? Like, for example, you try to find the best parameters for one patient and then have you use the same for someone else, so you have to find it.
So that's a really good question. And to our understanding, it's not the same. Most of the times, again, just because a clinician is able to fine tune, let's say for obsessive compulsive disorder for one patient, right? They've taken years to get that tuning properly. They can't just take that tuning parameter and give it to another patient. A lot of this is because each person's brain is wired a little bit differently. The central point, for instance, of where their, let's take epilepsy, for instance, the location of the seizure is going to be slightly different. And all of that plays a role into how this is all being played out. So when you give that shock, what is the appropriate shock depends heavily on, where you're giving the shock, what types of cells are around that area, how the brain is connecting, different ways across the region. So it is an area that I'm very curious to explore, like how much of the waveform can we carry over and transfer, and what is the portion left that needs to be fine-tuned. But yeah, really good question. Any other questions? All right. So one of the things that we did, kind of just as computational people, we start putting equations down for everything, right? And so we define our search space as, some arbitrary waveform. We have a system of equations that governs it. We know what our optimization equations are. And I'm using this diagram really as a very simplistic way to look at solutions, right? Every single point here represents a unique waveform. And so really, although it's portrayed here as a two-dimensional space, this is in reality a very large dimensional space that we're searching across. And we develop a performance metric of some sort, and we want to find the optimum solution. So I'm just going to convert this to a two-dimensional space and just collapse the z-axis just for visualization purposes. But whenever I'm looking at this, I'm looking at something like that. And so clinicians, again, like I was saying, what they often do is it's impossible to search every single point. So what clinicians often do is they restrict their search space to a very specific shape. And so, for instance, oftentimes for electrical stimulation, they use rectangular pulses. And so you can now tune the amplitude and the duration of the pulse, but that restricts your search space. So instead of searching every single point, they're searching within a small region and systematically then testing all the points along that region to find the optimal solution.
So just discretize amplitude and shape.
It's not even discretized. It's literally just a single rectangle. So it's collapsed to just amplitude and duration. So it's not even a series of these where they adjust and create.
Search over a grid for amplitude and duration.
Right.
Should that be a 2D grid? Why do you have it as a 1D?
Sorry, I have a 2D grid here, and they're two different dimensions.
And one is amplitude, one is.
One is amplitude, one is duration. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah. But this is still just a two-dimensional representation of a more complex system. So I know that, for instance, certain other therapies, they'll create pulse trains, and so the frequency of that will be a third dimension that they can search across. But you're right; it is a grid search across a narrowed space. So one of the first questions that Dr. Pedafar and I, so Dr. Pedafar was my PhD mentor, and so we worked together closely on this. So one of the first questions we tackled was, how true is it that the rectangular pulse is actually optimized by any metric? And so we said, well, why don't we actually take calculus approaches? So we know calculus is used often to calculate minimums, maximums. There's a whole variational field within calculus that looks at how do you calculate optimum functions within families of functions. And so we developed we used a gradient approach to slowly work our way through this multidimensional space. And what we found is that you can actually work your way across and slowly iterate towards a more optimal solution each time if you knew the mathematical equations of the system. Yes.
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
You're going to answer my question.
Oh,
I was
okay.
going to say you were talking about not knowing the dynamical space, right? So what kind of assumptions do you make in order to get the optimal control formulation in the first place? Right?
Yeah. So that's a great question. So for this one, what we did was let's just take something extremely simple. We took a single axon of a neuron. And this one has been well studied. So we have a series of four. So actually, it's called the Hodgkin-Huxley Model. And it's a series of four differential equations with a whole bunch of auxiliary equations. And what it is it stays basically at resting state. But if you give it a small pulse, it'll fire an action potential. And this action potential is essentially what goes on in all of our nerves. If your brain is telling your leg to move, an action potential is traveling down to your leg muscles to basically tell it to react. And so what we did was this action potential here is kind of an all or nothing mechanism. There is no like half action potential. So it creates a very discrete state where you have either a resting state or you have a action potential occurring. All right. So we took this, we put it, and again, because we know the equations now, all we wanted to do was see how valid is the idea that rectangular pulses are useful for optimizing these things. And so we slowly iterated our way through this. And what you see here is, in this plot here on the right, is just over the iterations, what the energy of the stimulus is, how much energy is being used. And you can see here, we found that this optimized waveform over here produces the action potential, but it uses about a third of the energy necessary to achieve the same outcome as a square pulse or as a rectangular pulse. And so just thinking about that, we were like, wow, this is pretty impressive, because if we're able to then use this waveform here, you can increase battery life for most of these devices by 3 times. It's just purely looking at the energetics required for the stimulus itself. Right? So then this led us to think, well, maybe the waveform itself is important, and we do need to think about modifying the waveform and not just simply modifying parameters of known waveform structures.
I was just going to ask, clarifying. So to clarify, the
Yep.
optimal control formulation is minimize total energy while reaching this goal state?
Yes.
Or, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And again, just to understand the model better, this model for the neuron. My vague understanding was that the neuron is basically an integrator of energy in a window, which would seem to suggest that if you cared about minimizing the energy, and then correct me if I'm wrong, but once you feed it enough, it's going to spike, and then it doesn't matter how much more you feed it, right?
So
is that roughly correct that it just looks at an approximate integral of energy in a time window, or is it a weighted integral?
So the integrated fire model is a simplistic version of the neuron, and it is often the very first model that's used to understand the neuron. But what Hodgkin-Huxley showed is that actually there's a resonance effect that's going on within that integrated fire. And so very similar to how, like in a swing, right? You can get someone up to a certain amplitude by just pushing them once, and then that'll get them up to amplitude, or you can slowly push them and use the resonant effect to then minimize the amount of energy necessary to fire to get them to a certain height. And so Hodgkin-Huxley is a much more accurate representation of what actually happens. But oftentimes for simplistic purposes and computational purposes, you're absolutely right. The integrated fire is sufficient for a lot of network-based understanding.
But this phenomenon would not happen under integrated fire. Under integrated fire, it would not matter. You would not be able to save battery.
Not with this waveform, no.
Right. With any waveform whatsoever. It's integrating over a window, right? So the only thing that will matter is the total amount of energy in the integration. So I guess what you're saying is you're literally exploiting that additional modeling nuance to save energy, if I'm understanding.
Yes, that is what we're doing here. Even with the integrated fire, if I remember correctly, an exponential ramp actually does better than a rectangular pulse waveform. And you're right. I think it is also because it's exploiting the capacitive effect of the neuron itself. And so therefore, if you were to looking at the integrated fire model, even the exponential ramping effect actually produces a much more efficient energy compared to a rectangular waveform. Now, let me just put a disclaimer here. All of this assumes that we're not taking into account the energy necessary to generate these waveforms itself. So that's something that we do want to look at in the future. If we were to put a black box around the device that's generating the waveforms itself, how do these waveforms change? But just purely from the perspective of looking at the signals themselves, this is showing a 70% reduction essentially in the energy itself to generate a single action potential. So now, this was really for us to set a baseline to understand, okay, well, in a very simplistic system, could we use known techniques, analytical techniques to find these solutions? But as was noted earlier, ultimately, we want to do this for model free. We want to do this without knowing what the model is. We don't know what the model is for most patients. Even for something as simple as if we wanted to cause a muscle twitch, for instance, we don't have good ideas or understandings of how, for instance, the spatial dimension plays a role in how electrical stimulus will propagate across someone's tissue, depending on how big the arm is, where the nerves are, so on and so forth. So can we develop a model-free algorithm? And this was one of the big areas that we've been working on recently. So again, analytical systems, we know the equations. And so we started looking at the stochastic search algorithms. And this was kind of the next phase. So we started with calculus, but now if we don't know what the system is, we put a black box around it and we stick in two electrodes. So we have an input and we have an output. If this is all we knew of the system, could we learn over time what the optimum solution looks like? And so, you know, I'm sure you guys are all very familiar with hill climbing, simulated annealing, genetic algorithms. These are all common techniques that are used. And this leads to then the idea of the cursive dimensionality, because when you deal with solutions with stimulus, and what we wanted to do was we wanted completely arbitrary waveforms, right? We wanted to know, ideally, if you had no restraints or constraints, sorry, on what the optimum was going to look like, could you find the optimized waveform? But as you can imagine here, if all we wanted was a triangular pulse and we were able to discretize the amplitude into 11 spaces, you would have 11 possibilities to test through, right? As you increase the resolution of both the amplitude discretization and the temporal discretization, then this exponentially increases. And this is known as the cursive dimensionality. Every single dimension you expand one more, you exponentially increase the search space that much more. And so this then led to a problem where if we wanted to look at a 30 millisecond stimulus and we were sampling at a 0.1 millisecond resolution, we would have a dimensional space of 300. And how do you search across 300 effectively? And so we developed this idea called extrema distortion. And extremas are often well used in signal processing and image processing, right? Like most of us, when we think of pattern recognition or pattern matching, especially with images, edge detection is one of the first things that almost everybody tries. We look at where the edges are, and we try to match and align the edges to create registration for images. Signal processing, the same thing if you're looking at temporal or audio signals. Extrema points are often the key indicators of whether your signal matches well or not. And so we said, well, why don't we start with the extremas and we only shift the extremas. Everything in between, we're just going to linearly interpolate for now, but we're going to move the extremas around to just kind of reduce the dimensional space that we're operating under. And so again, here, if this was our signal here, and this is just a zoomed in portion of this much bigger, messier signal here, we focus just on the extremas, and then we do searches just by jittering or distorting the extrema points just a little bit. And then we choose the best one from here. So this is ultimately a stochastic hill climbing process, but instead of searching across every single point, we're only focusing on the extrema points.
So how did you find the extrema points?
This was just a minimum maximum that we found, just find peaks.
Yeah, how do you find it?
Oh, well, so the stimulus is something that we're generating, right? So we have an array of 300 points that we're generating, then we just run a minimum maximum.
You get to generate the points yourself on the 300.
Yes. Yeah. So this is the stimulus that we're generating and we're feeding it into the system. Yes.
Is the model that you're treating as a black box differentiable? And if so, have you tried just nonlinear optimization and then you avoid the discretization problem altogether? And if so, have you compared it to nonlinear optimization to the black box approaches?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And we do not know if the system is differentiable as of right now.
Okay, well, I mean, you have the simulated model at least, right?
Yes.
To run these experiments, right?
Right.
So how do you not know if the simulated model
Sorry,
is-
so in that sense, yes, we do have, for the Hodgkin-Huxley, we do have a differentiable system that we could use linear optimization for.
Right.
But we wanted to, but this process, so maybe I'm misunderstanding the question, but this process here, we're trying to figure out if we were to take away the fact that we know the fact the system is differentiable, how would we apply the system? to
Right,
more
right. I
complex
understand, but
Oh, okay.
ostensibly for these results, you're using the simulated model that you're treating as a black box. And I
Right.
just wondered if you had compared to nonlinear optimization and you're taking away that black box assumption to get an idea of performance relative to at least a local optimum of your problem.
So, okay, so maybe I'm still not understanding.
Yeah, sorry.
But no worries. So what we did was we used the calculus approach earlier, and that's our ground truth now. So now we know what the optimum is, and that's what we're comparing all these methods against.
Oh, I see. Okay, it's the same.
Yeah.
It's the same model.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
So here you start with a random signal in the beginning.
Right.
You're trying to move the critical points.
Yep.
So the first signal is just random. Like-
Yes, the first signal is random because we're treating this as if we know nothing about the system that we're playing with right now.
And what's this experiment up?
This is all simulation right now.
Simulation.
Yeah. We, as I'll share later, we are hoping to move. We're working with another group in the neuroscience department to hopefully then move towards experimental work where, again, a lot of the ideas of what the model would look like, we have no way of understanding that at that point. One thing that kind of a byproduct of this particular method is that the number of extremas, as you can see here, these two extremas have flipped. And so in the next iteration, actually, these two extremas disappear. And so the number of extremas actually decreases over time, which then makes the system run even more effectively as it goes forward. So again, what I'm doing here is, this red line here is the optimum solution we found using calculus techniques. And we're using the system just as a baseline to compare our black box technique against a known analytical technique. And so when we run this, again, we give it completely random noise. We have no input on how big the noise should be. And within about 100 iterations, it gets something relatively close. It's pretty noisy, but it gets pretty close. And in terms of energy, it's almost the same amount of energy, as you can see over there, as the optimum solution. And so this was one way that we did this with this model, but we also used a couple other relatively simple models to look at dynamics that we could differentiate, that we were able to use the gradient approach to differentiate and find the optimal waveforms. And we were able to kind of convince ourselves that there's something here that we could use. So now, could we apply this technique to something more complex that we can't use traditional analytical techniques on? And so this idea of abnormal pathologies, again, like I said earlier at the beginning, happens both in the brain and the heart. And so we took examples from both of these. We have a very simple model of epilepsy. Again, large waveforms here, electrical stimulation, and you kind of correct it by this point here. We took some of these big population models and network models, and we applied our algorithms to it. And so here you can see these are two hypotheses. Unfortunately, there's no standard model right now for computational epilepsy. What does that look like? There's a lot of hypotheses about what this looks like, what it might mean, whether it's a desynchronization process or it's a bistable process. We looked at both desynchronization and bistability. Here, I'm just showing you the bistability results. But you can see here, we're able to find optimized waveforms that we're able to then shut off the repetitive firing that's known in epileptic behavior and epileptic activity. And one thing we noticed here, as you can probably see immediately, is that these waveforms are kind of in anti-phase to the abnormal behavior that's going on, right? And so you can almost imagine it as someone is kind of pushing, if you've got a child, for instance, swinging on a swing and you want to stop them, you could grab hold of the chain and then immediately stop them, but that's a lot of force that's required and exerted. But if you were to stop and push against the child as they're swinging at just the right times, you can actually mitigate and reduce the amount of energy necessary. So that's essentially what's happening here. A very phase-specific way of hitting, of electrically stimulating the patient in a way that counteracts the existing oscillations that's going on. And this is actually not, so we found this computationally, but we've seen experimental evidence of this as well, where there's a paper published that looked at someone that's having an epileptic event, they're getting shocked, and sometimes it actually causes an even bigger problem for that particular patient. And here, this is a plot that shows basically at different times how successful is that shock being given. And so for certain patients, depending on the timing, you can get up to 70% success in terms of suppressing these epileptic activities, but at other times it's 10%. And so depending on when you're giving it, there's a phase specific component to turning these things off. Yes.
Yeah, so as you mentioned with these stochastic search optimized curves, there's a little bit of jaggedness, a little bit of stochasticity in the solution. Do you suspect that the optimal solutions have maybe some more smooth structure? And if so, is there a way of enforcing that smooth structure? Have you looked into that at all? Or what are your thoughts?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's something that we want to explore more of. We did do initially a low pass filter, or sorry, a high pass filter, to get rid of a lot of the really high frequency noise that we figured the body just doesn't react to stuff this drastic. What we found is, and this is just really a matter of tuning, I think that we need to kind of explore a little bit more. But what we found is that when we filtered out too much of the high frequency, there wasn't enough space for it to explore to successfully get to where to some of the waveforms that we found. And so by doing that initial first pass filtering, it actually kind of biased the optimal solution away from optimality, and we actually got worse results sometimes with.
Interesting. So it comes back to the exploration problem. of
Right.
Reinforcement learning. In some sense.
Yes.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
You're like reading my mind, but we'll talk about, so reinforcement learning is kind of where we're going next after this, but yes.
I don't think how you train this. Like, so, okay, when you know the model,
Mhm.
you assume that you don't know it, then you can like just have like a signal and then observe the response and try to see what, like find an trajectory.
Right.
You know, but when you don't know the system, like how do you train it?
So in the model that I showed you, right, in this figure here, we generated, there are computational models that we use, but they're not validated yet. So we're just using them as surrogates right now for what?
As a black box, right? You're not back propagating through them all.
No, we're not.
You're just putting in lines, see the output, and
Yep.
just optimize black. It's a black box.
Like,
optimization.
this whole procedure is gonna be useful when you don't know anything about it. When you
Yes.
like, okay.
That's the
In
goal.
that case, how do you do it? Like, do you do it like 3 months and you observe them? Also, like, again, in the end, you're gonna find the solution that's hopefully optimal. But like, what if in the procedure of training, you just like use signals that have like, you know, code breakdowns?
Right. So those are two really good questions. So let me just start off. What we're imagining down the line, right, is that ultimately we have a device. I mean, deep brain stimulators already exist. So we just simply build in a chip that has an algorithm on it that we can then attach to these existing devices. Then, for instance, we put, someone with a smartwatch, for instance, we measure the gyroscopic activity or the accelerometer activity off of that, and we use that as feedback for if we wanted to suppress essential tremors, for instance, or Parkinsonian tremors. How do we suppress that while then using that as feedback information for whether or not the signals we're passing to the brain are successful or not successful? So that would be one feedback mechanism that we would use to then correct for certain pathological activity. Now, you're right. In the way of training, though, how do we not, kill somebody in the process to get to that point?
It's like completely random signal, right? So like,
right.
You send a signal, you don't know what happens.
So there's two ways I would answer that question. One is we do know that there are certain bounds, for instance, safety bounds that are relatively safe for stimulation, right? Deep brain stimulation is already being used right now. We know how much energy they're using for every stimulus is being given. So as long as we're using less than that, we are within the safety window. So that's one thing we would suggest. And seeing how much less energy is required in a lot of our waveforms than traditional rectangular pulses, we think we can operate within there and just find the optimized waveform there. The second piece of it that I would say is that I think to your question earlier, I think that there might be some, and this is a hypothesis that we haven't fully tested yet, but we think that there are fundamentally similar waveforms that are being used, and it's a matter of them fine tuning. So can we then train an initial guess, so to speak, that's not going to be as chaotic as what we see here with random noise, use that now as a starting point, and then have very small changes then used to then optimize it fully specifically for that particular patient and their particular pathology.
Thanks a lot.
But yeah, really good questions though. Same thing for the heart. Now, again, like I said, people with pacemakers, everyone's using something in the heart, and just very, this is a little bit of pathology, but here's a normal sinus rhythm. Electrical waves are normally going around in the heart. They start from one location, they sweep around the heart, and then that's what's causing different hearts, the different chambers in the heart to beat at different times, causing optimal blood flow through the heart. And we've all seen EKG signals. Now, if someone has what they call ventricular tachycardia, so there's a node here that these electrical waves are bypassing it, so it's causing a faster trigger in this area here. It causes an abnormal waveform here. And what happens is if you shock the heart, this can go back to that. But what we've also found is that this is also highly dependent on when the shock is being given. If you give it at the wrong time, nothing happens to the patient. They stay in their abnormal rhythms. And so timing, so there is something known as synchronized cardioversion. So, when you put the leads on somebody, for instance, in an emergency setting, the leads, depending on the situation, will actually look at what is the phase of the system itself, of the heartbeat, and then time it so that the shock is happening in a synchronized format.
Just a medical question. Like for AFib, that can be a relatively benign condition.
Mm-hmm.
VTAC, I mean that's generally a much more serious condition.
Right.
Than,
fatal and also is probably hiding some other major heart disease. I mean, so, I mean, it's probably, for VTAC or something, probably getting the shock right is like less important than, treating the underlying condition. For AFib, though, I guess maybe it would be better.
Right.
Or am I wrong?
No, you're right. So one of the things that, as we were kind of talking about this throughout as we've been kind of bouncing around ideas of what to look at next, if someone is, not, if they don't have a pulse and they need to get shocked right away in the hospital, we're not going to worry about optimizing the waveform. We just want them to start beating their heart again. It's like we want everything to start working again. So you're absolutely right. Like in certain scenarios, we're not going to sit around and, well, let's train the system and figure out what's the optimized waveform. But you're right. So in more benign conditions, that is something that we do want to think, okay, well, if we're going to be getting regular shocks, for instance, how do we optimize that so that we're not burning and destroying cardiac muscle at the same time?
Or how do you even decide, okay, this person has AFib, we should just hook them up with your smart control system instead of doing elevation.
So this one I would leave to the cardiologist. I don't know exactly at what point.
The cardiologist is going to come back to you and say, well, how well can you just manage this?
Right. Well, so then from that perspective, then ultimately we're going to need to have a clinical trial at some point to figure out what is the, if we took half the patients and did this versus the other half where they did an ablation, at what point do you kind of break even? And at what point does the cost of doing this outweigh the benefit of it?
But you're not there yet.
We're not there yet, no. Almost, like I said, everything we're doing right now is very much in simulation and trying to at least get the algorithms right so that we have something that's efficient. One of the things, like I showed you earlier, it still takes about 100 to 1,000 iterations of this process to find an optimized solution. This is with a simple single cell neuron. Realistically, I don't know how many patients are willing to sit through thousands and thousands of shocks just to find the right optimal solution.
No, you'll optimize the first and start from that. You don't have to start completely random. Start with the optimized one.
Yeah.
Random search.
Yes. So I mean that is exactly one thing we're thinking needs to be done. But one of the things for me, at least, I just want to build a little more confidence in what we're doing before we get to that point to start testing in human subjects. But just to kind of show you, this is one of the things that we've been playing around with is, we've talked a lot about how, especially with these oscillopathies or these pathological oscillations that's going on, you have to be very phase specific, or you have to time your stimulus at just the right time. Well, this is actually something we published relatively recently, but we were wondering, what if there's a waveform out there that could successfully do it no matter when you gave it? And so this is the heart, but this is a super, super simple version of the heart. But what you see here is there's a ring around the heart, and there are action potentials or waves that are kind of circling and traveling around this heart. I'm superimposing 8 different waves right now on this heart, and these are all equally spread out around the system so that they're at different phases. All right. And the goal that we had was, can we give a stimulus that will suppress successfully all of these? So no matter where the wave is, it'll successfully suppress and turn off that pathological wave in one cycle, in one wavelength. And at first we were thinking this might not be possible because everything we've seen so far is you have to give the stimulus at just the right time to knock out that particular wave, right? You look at what the frequency is of that waveform, you give something an anti-phase to it. And what we were surprised by is that as we're giving this here, this signal up here, again, this is 8 superimposed waveforms, each starting from a different phase. But that one waveform there, as it's progressing, you'll see is essentially knocking out all 8 waves, no matter where it started from. This is a phase, what we call phase agnostic stimulus. It doesn't matter when you're giving it, it'll always successfully knock out wherever the wave is in the process. Now, that being said, this waveform is requiring a lot more energy than if you knew what the phase was. But there are some systems where either the phase is constantly shifting because it's a stochastic system, so there's some noise in there, and so you can't know exactly when the phase is, or we might not be able to measure. We don't know exactly what the right signal to be measuring to know what phase that we should be looking at. And so the idea that we can use these methodologies to find optimized phase agnostic solutions is something of interest to us as well. So if we had something that we needed to give something to a patient, we didn't either know, or we couldn't find out, or we didn't have time to find out what phase that person was in, are there solutions that we can give that's optimized in a way so it's not too much energy, but still successfully able to knock out the waveform, regardless of, or the abnormal pathological behavior, regardless of what phase they are in. So this is now getting to the somewhat more recent work, and this is an area that we would definitely appreciate insights from you all. But this is a pretty standard control system, right? We have an agent here. We're generating waveforms here. We're testing it, and this is really what we've been doing as part of our stochastic search. We're just iterating through this process over and over again. Our reward structure is really, does it fire an action potential? We penalize it for the amount of signal that's being given here. But as was accurately pointed out earlier, realistically, this is not that different than a reinforcement learning algorithm. And so, can we use reinforcement learning techniques then to kind of learn from these patients in real time? So we're not just simply giving complete waveforms, but if we were to discretize this, could we then find out what the next stimulus pulse should be given? If we were to discretize it into very small waveforms, can we then figure out how to tune the stimulus? Yes.
Right. So here you're talking about using closed loop control, right? Some information about the current state of the brain after you apply this much of the pulse to adjust the rest of the pulse, correct?
Right.
So what kind of feedback or information are you able to get in real time that allows you to adjust the pulse in real time? And is that something that you think will be feasible in the real world?
So what we're hoping is, right now, we're able to measure the voltage memory potential of the system. Whether for humans, this would have to be at the level of population voltage memory potential. So if you have an EEG on a patient, you can measure the electrical output at that particular time. So then that's kind of where we're thinking. Now, if we're talking about a tissue, we can actually put an electrode into a single cell, for instance, and look at the voltage memory potential of that particular cell, and then use that to feedback what's going on here. Ultimately, in what we've been working with so far, just for action potentials, that's all we're looking at, just whether the voltage memory potential crosses a certain threshold or not.
So that's the state of your system.
That's the state.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Very cool. Very cool. Thanks.
And again, the reward here, we're still using the idea of success minus the amount of energy necessary to achieve that state. So we took the Hodgkin-Huxley equation, the equation that I showed you at the very beginning, 4 differentiable variables. We created an open AI gym environment. And this was actually done by Varun Sridhar. He was one of the software engineers that worked with our team at that time. And as you can see, we specified what our action space was, our observation space, again, 4 differential equations. So we knew what the state variables were. And at this point, we're assuming that we knew all the state variables. Right. Now, realistically, we don't necessarily know what some of these hidden state variables are, but just for the sake of whether or not this works, how well does this work, we just assume that you knew what the observation space was. And then we constructed our reward system kind of twofold, very similar to how we've done it before, where there's an action penalty. So the amount of energy that's being required. Sorry, there should be a negative sign here. So we take off the square of the action, and then we add in a reward if it successfully fires an action potential or doesn't fire an action potential. And one of the things that we found that was kind of cool is actually, it converged fairly quickly. So the amount of reward generated, again, with 10,000 being the optimal solution, you can see it's pretty close. That deviation from 10,000 is really because of the energy required in the stimulus itself. So you can see it converged actually really quickly. But what we found is that the length of the time from when you start the episode to when the action potential is fired is only about 2.5 milliseconds. So this is a much shorter stimulus compared to what we are normally using. And so just to give you a visual, this is our system response here. This is the stimulus. And these are the optimized waveforms that we found using analytical techniques. The optimized waveform used by reinforcement learning was to just give an extremely strong pulse here to fire the action potential immediately. So this is very equivalent to, the way I kind of imagine it is if you want your child to get to a certain height in the swing, you could push them extremely hard, take a sledgehammer at it, and then they'll get up to the height that you want. Or you can more gently kind of push them at just the right time to leverage the fact that there's a resonant effect that's going on. And so reinforcement learning is finding out basically that the optimized waveform in this particular instance that gets you the action potential is to just go ahead and take a sledgehammer at it. And it'll knock you in right away.
Don't want to take a sledgehammer.
Probably not. Yeah, that would not be a repeatable experiment. So what we thought was interesting was that this finding that we had actually was in line with some of the other stuff that we did before. when we knew what again, using our knowledge of the equations, what we did was we wanted to optimize it for different durations of stimulus. So here we're optimizing it for a 30 millisecond stimulus. We used analytical techniques, calculus to figure out what this was. And we did it all the way back to 2.5 milliseconds. And as you can see here, at 2.5 milliseconds, it does look like a single pulse. And so what we found is that reinforcement learning is indeed optimizing it that is an optimized waveform, but it's optimized, somehow it's incorporating the fact that duration is also a factor in that reward structure. And one of the things that Varun and I have been talking about is just that there is as you guys are probably more aware of this than I am, but just the fact that there's a discounting factor in your reward structure, right? The longer it goes, the more discounted your solutions become. And so therefore, we're wondering if we need to figure out how to restructure our reward function in a way so that we're not taking into account the fact that 30 milliseconds here, you're basically multiplying your discounting factor 299 times or 250 times compared to a much shorter waveform pulse.
Why use a discount factor at all? You have a fixed time horizon, correct? So
Yeah.
why not just formulate it as a finite horizon problem? And then obviously you need to augment the state space with the time index, but have you looked into doing something along those lines?
We haven't. So that's something that we need to explore a little bit more. That's not something we are aware of, I guess. But one thing that we did try was we tried removing the discount factor. So we set it at 1, just to see if we were to remove the discount factor. But what happened was then the thing never converged. So we didn't think about expanding the state space, I guess, to include time into it and seeing how that plays out. But you're right, that's an interesting idea that we should explore.
Yeah, I think Dimitri Berzikas recommends that.
Okay.
As optimal control.
Okay. Yeah, so we'll definitely explore that. Yes.
So are you using the policy gradient or use like a temperature difference method to know the reinforcement and stuff?
Sorry, so we're using, sorry, I forgot to say this, we're using DDPG. So we're using policy gradients to solve this. Yeah.
If you use the DDPG, then if you use this kappa equals to 1, the Fermi equivalent for the effect. So that method with the effect, which is
Okay, yeah. Yeah, I mean, it is one of the things that we were just thinking that, setting the discount factor to 1, we assumed that there would be downstream effects that we hadn't fully taken into account, but that probably explain it. We also looked at soft actor critic as well, just because we understood that soft actor critic allowed for increased entropy in your search space to try to see if it could get out of that locally optimal solution. But soft actor critic basically gave us the same result, where it's just a large pulse, and then that just fired off the action potential right away. And so we were thinking that it might be then not so much the algorithm itself, but our reward structure that we might need to rethink or revise how we're structuring the environment and the rewards. So this is an area that we're definitely exploring, and we're really interested to seeing how, again, thoughts from the expertise that you guys have and how we can leverage some of that to see. Ultimately, the goal is to be able to take, like I said earlier, to take a lot of these systems and tools. How do we apply this ultimately to the patient down the line? And so kind of future directions, like I said earlier, improving that reward function and ultimately the environment at large is one of the big things we're trying to understand. Like I said earlier, also, we're starting to have conversations with neuroscientists in our department that actually have rat brain tissue that they can create and make epileptic. And so can we then apply this in an epileptic brain slice, for instance, to turn off the epileptic behavior? So we actually do have tissue now, and starting thinking about building hardware to structure some of these, to actually develop devices to do some of the things that we've been talking about. And finally, like was mentioned earlier, the idea of transfer function. How do we develop better personalization so that we're not relearning each of this every time, but how can we leverage either portions of the neural net for the actor critic methods to then leverage that to train much more quickly personal reinforcement learning solutions for each individual. But so this is kind of where we're going and where we're hoping to continue to explore a lot of our research. But any questions?
Some questions. Anyone have questions? That was great.
Yes.
I do have a question. I do apologize that I have to jump out later, so I won't hear your answer. But that's I'm joking. I will hear your answer, but I will have to leave soon. But my main question is: are there artificial neural nets or other simulators that seem to have going in a bad spot but in a good spot, and if this nudging behavior can be used for them. One thing that came in my mind that could be something interesting to use when we're training GANs, like general adversarial networks, they go in what's called mode collapse mode sometimes.
Okay.
Trying to generate images and just get in this bad spot where they try to generate the same image.
Mm-hmm.
And this happens in a really sharp phase transition during the training process. The training is not supervised. The training is a dynamic system.
Mm-hmm.
So it is truly, when you're training a supervised, there's none of the dynamics, the complex dynamics that would see this funny behavior. But I think for generative models, or when you're solving min-max in general, you could be getting this behavior where you get in a bad spot, and then you could nudge it somehow. I mean, one way you could nudge it is just add noise to the weights of the training, or just, do something.
Right.
I don't know if you've seen anything like that or in an artificial neural network that's actually doing a job. Of course, you can design that dynamical system to do that. That's not that interesting to me. What's more interesting is there's an artificial neural that's actually trying to do a job.
Mm-hmm.
It gets in a bad spot, and you just slap it around, and it just gets back to the good equilibrium.
I just don't know enough about that area. But I could see what you're saying, that there's a lot of analogies or parallels between what we're doing and what you're describing. And so, how do we leverage some of these tools perhaps to figure out what is the right spot, for instance, to apply the noise to? I think that's something that definitely would be interesting to explore a little bit more.
Given that this problem is fundamentally one of search, I mean, have you tried active learning or Bayesian active learning?
We've looked at it. I haven't tried it yet, but that's an area that we do want to explore. One of the problems with Bayesian active learning that we've hit, and one of the reasons why we haven't explored it as far, is just the dimensional size of what we're looking at. And so if we were to collapse it to say 5 dimensions, and we only looked at 5 parameters of our 300 space, then could we use active learning, for instance, to then build out, or Bayesian active learning to create the space, the probabilities, right? The other thing I was looking at is, well, given the fact that we're looking at extremas, does that collapse allow us to then use Bayesian active learning? And part of the challenge is that the number of extremas then changes from iteration to iteration. And so then we would have to figure out a way to map the different search spaces to a lower dimensional space in order to then kind of leverage the information or knowledge gained from that space to the next one.
Right. I mean, there are knobs you can.
Right. But I mean, when I know that there's been work done for like cancer drug treatments where people have looked at, if I was to give these 4 drugs, what dosage do we give, and how do you apply? Vicolo's work with using Bayesian active learning to find drug optimizations. So that was what kind of got us really excited, and we started looking into it. And it's something we still want to explore, but we just need to think about how do we get past some of these challenges. Yes.
So you said in the environment that you define in the gene, it's fully observable. But you said in real practical setting, it will not get to observe some of these parameters in the state. So have you tried in the partially observed setting by any chance, and see if it produces any reasonable solution?
So that's kind of where we wanted to go next with the reinforcement learning. We wanted to first figure out if we can make it so that we can find an optimized waveform similar to what we know is optimal before you're absolutely right though. The idea that partially observable, how well does this work under those conditions? We want to make sure we got fully observable right before we moved on to partially observable.
Okay, well, thanks again, Josh, for coming. It was a great talk. Really enjoyed that. Thank you.
Yeah.